And now recognize the honourable member from Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today to speak to Bill S-224. This is an incredible bill doing important work when it comes to fighting human trafficking. I want to acknowledge the hard work of the sponsors of the bill, Senator Tulajan, who steered this bill through the Senate, and the MP for Oshawa has been championing this bill here in the House and this issue for many years. This bill is critical to Canada's effort to target and apprehend pimps and traffickers, and I want to begin by reviewing the bizarre situation we found ourselves in today. This bill in front of us was an empty bill. It didn't even have a title. Now, this bill S-224 was introduced in November of 2021 in the Senate. It passed second reading there in April 2022, and by October it had passed the Senate unanimously. Here in the House, Bill 224 passed second reading unanimously and was sent to committee, where it had the testimony from a number of survivors and frontline organizations, all calling for this bill to be passed. Then in last June, I was at the final Justice Committee meeting on this bill, where it became clear that the NDP and the Liberals suddenly didn't want this bill to pass. I was shocked to see the Liberals and the NDP gut this bill during clause by clause. I'd never seen anything like this before. They had an option of recommending the House not proceed, but instead they gutted the bill and removed even the title and sent it back here as a blank piece of paper. This bill, fighting human trafficking, had unanimous support every step of the way through the Senate and House of Commons until 7 Liberals and an NDP MP decided to destroy it. So here we are today debating important amendments to restore the clauses of the bill. The reasons why survivors and frontline anti-trafficking organizations are calling for this bill to be passed is because our human trafficking offences aren't accomplishing what we want them to do. Our current human trafficking offences puts a burden of proof on the mindset of the victim rather than the actions of the trafficker. This is contrary to the international legal standard called for in the Palermo Protocol that Canada signed on to over 20 years ago. The Palermo Protocol defines human trafficking based on the actions of the traffickers. The actions like threats or use of force or other forms of coercion or abduction or fraud or deception or of abuse of power or position of vulnerability. In contrast, our laws are much more narrow. At the committee, Dr. Janine Benedict, a law professor from UBC's Allard School of Law, told the Justice Committee members, and I quote, "The definition of trafficking in the Canadian Criminal Code at present is unnecessarily convoluted and too restrictive. It's very hard for victims to come forward and have an offense, and having an offense that is so difficult to prove makes matters worse. Removing the requirement to prove the reasonable fear for safety, as this bill does, would be very helpful because it is inappropriate to impose a reasonableness requirement on victims. We should be focusing on the actions of the trafficker." Dr. Bennett also pointed out that the fear of safety is not the only way that traffickers influence and control their victims. We do not require this type of subjective focus from victims for other laws like sexual assault. Mr. Speaker, we have seen the impact of this restrictive definition on human trafficking in the criminal code. For a 10-year period between 2011 and 21, only 12% of adult human trafficking cases resulted in a guilty decision. That's only 1 in 8 cases. Human trafficking cases are half as likely to result in the finding of a guilty finding as cases involving sexual offences or violent crime. This is tragic and largely because convictions so often require the testimony of victims. This gap in our law has even been noted by our strongest ally. Every year for the past few years, the United States government's Trafficking in Persons report has urged Canada to amend the criminal code to include the definition of trafficking that has exploitation as an essential element of the crime, consistent with international law. An important question we always need to ask about any legislation is who stands to benefit if this bill is defeated. For example, we've seen over the past number of years how Liberals have worked to protect the big pharmaceutical companies. In fact, over the past few years, Liberal cabinet ministers have aided big pharmaceutical companies by keeping drug prices high for Canadians. The Liberals have helped bring more profits more profits into the pockets of big pharma executives. So with Bill S-224, who stands to benefit if this bill is gutted or defeated? Pimps and traffickers. That's tragic. However, it's consistent with this government, who has blocked consecutive sentencing for traffickers after being adopted by this parliament, reduced human trafficking offenses to a hybrid offense, meaning traffickers would get away with sometimes as little as a fine, and extending house arrest for human trafficker offenses. So who benefits from all these charges, Mr. Speaker? Pimps and traffickers. Further, this government has been so negligent in appointing judges that this year a sex trafficker in human trafficking had 2 separate human trafficking cases thrown out due to delays. And each time these cases collapse, it denies justice to victims and their families and allows dangerous individuals to return to the street. So let me be clear, by killing this bill, the Liberals and the NDP are helping traffickers stay out of jail. They're making it easier for traffickers to continue their business as usual. And the Liberals and the NDP are helping to put more money in the pockets of violent pimps. Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude by highlighting the important testimony from survivors and advocates that showed up at the Justice Committee. Wendy Gee, the Executive Director of A New Day, Youth and Adult Services, and a mother of a daughter who is trafficked, told the committee that out of all the young women they have supported, only 2 came forward and provided a statement to law enforcement about the trafficking situation. Wendy urged the committee to adopt Bill S-224, stating, and I quote, "Eliminating the burden of proving that they were fearful while they were being exploited tells the victim that we believe them, and what they have endured was not a measure of their worth or value. It was not indicative of the type of treatment they deserved, and it was not the result of poor decision-making that their victimization was not allowed to continue by our justice system." Cassandra Diamond, a survivor of trafficking and a founder of an executive director of an organization called Bridge North, also spoke to the committee, and I quote, "Bill S-224 would support victims by reducing the burden they experience when testifying and trying to prove they feared their trafficker. The proposed amendment would eliminate the difficult requirements that the criminal code currently places on prosecutors to show there was a reasonable basis for the survivor to fear for her safety. This would account for the situations like mine, where traffickers had manipulated me to see him as somebody who offered safety and protection rather than someone who facilitated brutal sexual violence against me as he trafficked me. This bill would support victims in coming forward to the court processes and reduce barriers and allow more victims to feel safe to share their allegations over time." End quote. Cassandra ended her testimony with the following: "Canada's trafficking survivors deserve better than what we currently have, and Bill S-224 is that better." I would ask my NDP and Liberal colleagues, do they believe survivors like Cassandra, who has made this clear that this bill would make an extreme difference? Don't my Liberal and NDP colleagues believe that a survivor deserves better? Do they believe that when they say Bill S-2, do they believe it when survivors say that Bill S-224 is that better? Mr. Speaker, Canada needs to do much more in its fight against human trafficking, and this bill is an important start. That's why I'm pleased to support restoring the text of the bill today, and I will urge all of my colleagues to support this. I want to thank my colleague from Oshawa for his great work on this bill, and all the survivors who have been relentless in calling for this change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the honourable member.